Okay, in this video, we are going to be talking about the function of words in sentences. So it's going to be a little bit different from talking about the forms of words. So we're not interested as much in like what's a noun, what exactly is an adjective. We're instead looking at how words function. And so that's going to be a little bit different. So the first function that I want to talk about in terms of a sentence is a subject. So the subject of the sentence is going to be the focus of the sentence or the occasion for the sentence. And the subject is also going to be linked to the verb. So the verb is going to be conjugated in relationship to the subject of a sentence. And so that can be a noun, but it could be other things. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a couple of examples. So I'm going to use a capital letter, right? All sentences in standard English are going to start off with a capital letter. So I'm going to say something like the tiger. Or I am going to show you another example that does not have a noun, being late. Okay. In both of these instances, here we have a noun phrase, and here we have a gerund. These are going to function for us like the subject in a sentence. And we will get to what that sentence will look like in just a moment. So bear with me here. All right, so a predicate then in a sentence is going to refer to the finite verb form, right? Which means it's going to match the grammatical subject. Okay. And let me give you a couple of examples. So the tiger roars. Okay. Roars here would function like a predicate. Okay. Or I might say being late was. Okay. And I'm not going to put a period. I'm just going to do a dot, 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 an ellipsis, because that's not a complete sentence yet. So these are two examples of how predicates connect, right, with what is functioning like a subject. So what's important to note is that it's not as simple as like noun, verb, direct object as we usually talk about it. So before we jump into the other functions in a sentence, we're going to talk about clauses for just a second. Because what you need for a clause is a grammatical subject, right? And a predicate. Okay. So I could have an independent clause that is as simple as the tiger roars. You might want more information, but I have a subject, I have a predicate. So this then is an independent clause, which means that it is a complete sentence. It stands on its own. So most of what we're going to be talking about in terms of functions in a sentence are going to be, right, functions within clauses that we might have. All right, so then let's go ahead then and shift to talking about subject complements, which are not something that we talk about very often, but are super, super important. A subject complement restates or elaborates on the subject. Okay. So I am going to give you several examples of this. I could change the sentence and say the tiger was hungry. Okay. Hungry here would be a subject complement. Okay. It tells us something about the tiger. Another way that I could show this would be being late was stressful, right? Stressful is a subject complement, okay? It tells us something about being late. So the subject complement almost always appears in sentences that have a form of the verb to be as its predicate. It also appears commonly in sentences like ones that feature the word become. So they became cops, right? That's still restating the subject or elaborating on the subject, and thus it's a subject complement. So this is important because it means in sentences it's not always subject, verb, direct, object, right? Here we have subject, predicate, subject complement. And I'm saying predicate because predicate kind of encapsulates much more of the sentence. Verb is not wrong to say, and it's totally fine when you're dealing with like kids. It's just important to know kind of what parts of a sentence belong to which parts. So here, what we have is a subject complement, and that is going to be quite different from looking at a direct object. So a direct object can be identified because it differs from the subject. Okay. I like to think about it as it introduces new information into a sentence. Okay. And I will give you a couple of examples. So the tiger was bringing. So don't be fooled, even though we have the word was, bringing is actually our predicate. So it's a very different type of sentence. Food. Okay. Now, food is not the same as tiger. So we're introducing additional information, which means it's a direct object, right? The tiger is bringing it. And so because it is different from the tiger, what you have here is a direct object. And these are simple sentences. We'll get into more complicated ones as you move into the practice quizzes, but I think sometimes just having a baseline understanding can be really helpful. So the tiger was bringing food. Solid example of a sentence that has a subject, predicate, and a direct object. Now, indirect objects in English are quite interesting because they can appear in a couple of different places in terms of a sentence. So an indirect object differs from the subject and the direct object. Okay. So one of the most important things is that it is neither a subject nor a direct object. And additionally, it introduces new information. Or you can kind of think about it as like a third set of information into the sentence. And I will give you two examples using the same sentence. So the tiger was bringing his family food. Okay. Um, his family is our indirect object. All right. And in English, we often put the indirect object before the direct object. So that way we can get rid of the preposition that would otherwise go there. And I'm going to give you an illustration of what that sentence would be like. So otherwise, the way we would have to say this is the tiger was bringing food to his family. So if the indirect object follows the direct object, it will almost always have a preposition along the lines of to, right? As a means of introducing that third bit of information. And again, the tiger is distinct from the food and is distinct from the family. So we have three sets of information. Okay. And that's what really distinguishes the indirect from the direct object. So next up is something that's a little bit similar to the subject complement, but it's called an object complement. And what an object complement does is restates or elaborates on the direct object. So instead of doing it with a subject, now we're just doing it with a direct object. So here is an illustration. The tiger hurt. The tour guide Alexis Reuter. Okay. Um, Alexis Reuter is your object complement, because tour guide is your direct object. And the object complement is just kind of giving you another way of talking about the tour guide. So in that sense, it's still part of that main sentence. It doesn't exist on its own, but it is introducing additional information. And so that's what makes it a complement as opposed to an additional object. Alexis Reuter is not a separate person from the tour guide, so it's not an indirect object. Okay. So these are the main components in terms of function when you're dealing with like a larger clause or what we talk about as a sentence. Now I want to get into some of the like nitty-gritty specifics, so like smaller parts of sentences. So determiners are a really interesting set of words, and I guarantee you have heard them before, but we're going to talk about them just briefly. So determiners qualify the main noun in a noun phrase. Okay. And I am going to give you an example. So articles, which would be the, a, and an, are determiners. Okay. So let me give you an example. Let's say the cheese, right? The here functions like a determiner, even though its form is a definite article. Now, this is important because possessives can also function like determiners. So we could say Ava's cheese, right? Or their cheese. Um, we could say this cheese, that cheese, one cheese, etc. All of these types of words function like determiners. So especially for any of you who are going to be working with little kids, it can be really useful for you to have this background. So when a kid comes to you and is like, but there's no the, there's no A. You know what it is you're talking about. A noun doesn't need to be preceded by an article. It can be preceded by a determiner, and an article might be a type of determiner. Now, you don't necessarily have to explain like using those terms to kids, but you could talk to them about the fact that what the word does, right? Its function is to help us understand the noun. And so then instead of looking for another article, the question is there a word there that tells us something about the noun? And then that allows us to explain why we might have a word like Ava's instead of the. Okay. Um, Another type of function that you see for a lot of words in sentences are modifiers. And these are almost always going to be adjectives or adjectivals, which means that they function like adjectives, even though they're not adjectives. So for instance, you might have a noun that functions like an adjective. It would be an adjectival noun or a noun that's being used adjectively. Similarly, the other common type of modifier are the adverbs or adverbials, right? Which similarly just means function like adjectives, or sorry, adverbs, not adjectives. We've already talked about adjectives. Um, One kind of common form that this takes would be prepositional phrases. We use them adverbially and adjectively all the time. So it might be, for instance, like of the house or to the tree. These are phrases, so groups of words that we use like we use adjectives or like we use adverbs. So we talk about them a little bit differently. In terms of the way we'll be talking about them this semester, we'll be looking at how they modify certain words. So for instance, I might say the delicious cheese. Okay. Delicious here is an adjective, but it modifies cheese. And so what I'm going to be concerned with is that you know that it modifies cheese. Let me give one more example. So if I said the really delicious cheese, okay. Delicious, we've already said, functions like an adjective. It modifies cheese, and we can all agree on that. So then really poses an interesting question. Here, it actually functions like an adverb because it modifies delicious and not cheese. It tells you how delicious the cheese is. So this is all still part of the noun phrase, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it is really important to be able to identify which words modify which words, or which sets of words modify which words. Okay. The next type of word that I want to talk to you about are connectors, or like connecting words. These are most commonly going to be conjunctions. They connect words or groups of words or sometimes whole sentences. And you have coordinating conjunctions. The acronym for this is fanboys. But these are words like and, but, so, etc. Okay. So good to be aware of and familiar with those. And there are also subordinating conjunctions. And there's not a set list of these, so it's always good to look them up, but they would be words like since, or because. Okay. And I will give you a couple of examples. So we might have, let's see. My cat and I, right? Where and functions like a connector for my cat and I, maybe the subjects of a sentence. Or we might have since I can remember, right? I loved cats. Granted, not the best sentence ever, but you get the idea. Since is a connector. It connects the dependent clause, I can remember, with the independent clause, I love cats. Okay. So the last thing that I want to talk about a little bit is why all of this matters. And it is actually super, super important. So one of the things that I remember learning in grade school was that a sentence is a subject, verb, and direct object. That is not accurate. Okay. I read. This is a complete sentence. It has a subject, it has a verb, it has no direct object. Okay. I was hungry. Okay. Here we have a subject complement. So we have a subject, a verb, and a subject complement. Once again, no direct object. So when a kid comes to you, especially if you're going to teach and asks you about the direct object, you need to be aware that all that is required for a sentence, for a baseline sentence, is a subject and a predicate, a finite verb. Some sentences has subject complements. Not every sentence has a direct object. The other thing that I hear commonly is that a subject is a noun. Once again, I want to point out a sentence I wrote earlier, being late was stressful. Okay. Being late is our subject. Being is what is called a participle, which is a form of a verb, right? And late is an adverb. It's telling you when something is going on, right? That means that this subject right here is not a noun. It's not something simple and straightforward like the tiger. It is important for you to be aware of the fact that not all subjects are nouns. Because once again, like if you have a kid who's asking you about this, even though it might feel simpler to say, well, nouns are subjects. Nouns can also be direct objects, right? If we were to say, right, the tiger has two paws, right? Paws are a noun. But they are also the direct object of this sentence. So it's good to know or to be aware of the forms of words, but more importantly, it's very important for you to be aware of how words function in sentences and that forms do not necessarily determine function. Okay.